Here's the shocking truth. Moving to M365 in KRITIS or government isn't a technical problem. It's an organizational survival challenge. One overlooked misstep with identity or governance doesn't just slow you down. It can undermine your compliance with BSI before you even get started. This isn't theory. It's happened in real projects. So the bigger question is, how do you actually avoid those traps and deliver a secure, compliant rollout? Why most M365 projects fail. What if I told you that most regulated Microsoft 365 deployments are already non-compliant before the first user even signs in? That sounds exaggerated, but in practice it plays out more often than you'd expect. The problem doesn't come from some obscure technical corner case. It usually starts with how organizations underestimate the complexity of baseline security and BSI requirements when shifting to the cloud. The rollout looks smooth from the outside, licenses get assigned, and services light up quickly. But the foundation beneath those services rarely lines up with what auditors expect to see from day one. A lot of IT leaders come into this move with a sense of reassurance. The logic sounds straightforward. Microsoft runs a global cloud. It has countless compliance certifications, so surely most of the hard lifting around regulation has already been taken care of. And yes, Microsoft has done serious work to get its platform approved for different international markets. But the dangerous assumption is thinking certification of the platform equals compliance of the customer. It's a classic gap in shared responsibility. Microsoft provides features and infrastructure compliant with different standards. Whether you enable them correctly, set them up according to local law, and build governance on top of them, that remains entirely on your shoulders. You can imagine where this leads. A public authority pressed by political timelines pushes through a Microsoft 365 rollout in just a couple of months. The rollout itself is celebrated as a success, mail migrations done, teams adopted, SharePoint online for document workflows. From a user perspective, the transformation looks complete. Then the first real audit hits a few months later. Auditors request detailed identity documentation, want to see control records for privileged accounts, and check whether specific BSI mandates have been applied. What they get back are screenshots taken after the fact, gaps in audit trails, and makeshift explanations on where data residency is supposed to be guaranteed. The verdict is not pretty, non-compliant, even though the technical services were working fine. That brings us to the uncomfortable truth. The issue isn't that Microsoft lacks features. The toolbox is there. The issue is that most organizations plan their rollout like a normal IT project, license, configure, deploy, while BSI standards require a completely different mindset. It's less about lighting up services and more about proving at every step who has access, how logs are handled, and how responsibilities are documented. Without that proof, the rollout may appear successful on the surface, but from a compliance perspective, it's already failed. Think of it like securing your house with brand new smart locks on every door, cameras on every entrance, motion sensors in the hallway, and then forgetting to close the bathroom window. That single oversight is the first thing an auditor notices, not the 20 controls you implemented correctly. Compliance works the same way. An organization can map out 50 technical policies, but if just one critical gap in identity management or operational documentation exists, the audit outcome is already negative. So what are the traps that BSI auditors spot immediately? They don't need weeks of forensic analysis to see non-compliance. In fact, the first gap shows up right at the start. Identity architecture is often inconsistent, relying on outdated on-premises directory sync without full conditional access in place. Alongside that, documentation is either missing or written after the project, which auditors instantly recognize. These are red flags visible within the first few days of reviewing a project, not months down the line. And here's the painful reality. You don't fail compliance years later when a regulator knocks on the door. You fail inside the first 90 days because the rollout wasn't planned with BSI expectations in mind from the beginning. By the time red lines become visible, the environment is already in production, users have adjusted, and quick fixes are hard to apply without disruption. That's why so many organizations find themselves scrambling after launch instead of moving smoothly into steady operations. That early failure tells us something important. It's not about how fast you migrate mailboxes or light up teams. The true success or failure is decided much earlier. The first 3 months expose whether the planning process was aligned with regulation or just copied from a generic cloud adoption template. If mistakes happen there, they cascade into the rest of the environment. To avoid that domino effect, we need to look closely at what should happen before assigning a single license, because that preparation phase is where compliance is either secured or lost. So let's get ahead of those failures by looking at the planning phases that actually determine success. The 3 planning phases of a compliant rollout. What if your M365 compliance success is already decided before you even assign the first license? It sounds counterintuitive because most people think the real work starts after you provision accounts and roll out Teams or Exchange. The reality is different. Long before you press the first migration button, there are 3 planning phases that build or break compliance: strategy, architecture, and governance. Miss one of them, and you create weak points that turn into audit findings months later. Think of it as a chain. Skip a link, and the whole chain no longer holds. I've seen how fast the domino effect plays out. A city administration rushed to adopt Teams because of political pressure during remote work mandates. The project team skipped the strategy phase entirely, treating Teams as a quick win to keep collaboration alive. What they didn't account for was the strict data residency requirement tied to their regional regulations. Within weeks, files were stored outside permitted zones, logs didn't match retention rules, and auditors flagged the rollout before it even hit full adoption. The cost of fixing this later was far greater than if they had put the time into mapping compliance at the start. It's proof that these planning phases aren't theoretical, they make or break projects in the real world. The first phase, strategy, isn't about technical diagrams or licensing spreadsheets. It's about defining compliance goals in plain language and mapping them to BSI standards. That means identifying which services or workloads fall under KRITIS requirements, clarifying what kind of documentation auditors will expect, and deciding how much flexibility you want around user experience. Without this phase, you're flying blind. You might deploy technology that technically works but cannot later be certified for regulated use. A strong strategy phase sets the guardrails. These are the rules, this is the scope, this is how success is measured. It's not glamorous, but it saves you from chasing auditors with last-minute paperwork months into production. Once you have the strategy clear, you enter phase 2, architecture. This is where reality checks arrive. Here you decide which M365 services fit within the compliance framework and which ones don't. Not everything Microsoft offers can be put into production under KRITIS without adjustments. Some workloads meet certification requirements, others require added safeguards or simply can't be used for regulated data. In practice, this might mean using Exchange Online and SharePoint with strict conditional controls, but restricting services like Planner or Loop until compliance questions are resolved. I've seen IT teams surprised when they discover that a new service lights up automatically with their license but can't actually be deployed without violating data residency or logging requirements. That's where architecture forces uncomfortable but necessary choices: what gets enabled, what stays disabled, and how integrations are built to ensure logs, identities, and data site in acceptable places. Then we come to governance, the third phase. This is often treated as an afterthought, when in fact it should be built before the first user logs in. Governance means defining usage rules, assigning roles, and creating escalation processes. Who creates teams? Who grants external access? What happens when sensitive data is shared outside approved channels? These aren't abstract policy debates, they turn into audit records. A clear governance plan keeps you consistent and prevents shadow IT behaviors from undermining your compliant architecture. Without governance, even the best strategy and architecture collapse under the weight of inconsistent human actions. Users will work around controls if they don't understand them, and auditors won't accept "we told people not to do that" as an excuse. When you look at these three phases together, you see the domino effect clearly. Skip strategy and your architecture gets built on guesswork. Skimp on architecture and your governance rules have nothing to enforce. Fail at governance and all the careful planning of strategy and architecture gets undermined in daily practice. Each phase supports the next, and if one collapses, the others topple quickly. This is why compliant rollouts don't start with licenses, they start with planning. Organizations that follow these three phases reduce audit risks dramatically. Instead of scrambling after an audit to retrofit logs, rebuild identity, or write policies, they walk in with documentation that aligns to BSI expectations from the outset. They don't waste time trying to prove after the fact that they meet requirements. They can show it on day one. That shift from reactive to proactive is where real resilience begins. But out of these three, the most fragile piece is architecture, specifically identity architecture. You can define the best strategy and governance plans on paper, but if the login system isn't compliant, everything else falls apart. And that's where many projects discover their first serious roadblocks. Identity, the first real test. What if the very system you use to log in is also the one that decides whether you pass or fail compliance? That might sound dramatic, but in a regulated Microsoft 365 environment, identity isn't just a convenience layer for users. It's the backbone of the entire platform, and it carries direct audit relevance. When auditors review an environment, one of the first things they check isn't how email is migrated or how Teams is configured, it's the way accounts are managed, secured, and documented. If this piece isn't airtight, nothing else matters because every other service depends on it. The challenge comes from competing pressures. On one side, users and business leaders want seamless single sign-on for every application. On the other side, regulators demand strict controls like mandatory multi-factor authentication, conditional access, and continuous risk evaluation. Trying to meet both expectations at once can feel impossible. You design an identity solution that seems transparent for end users, but if the rules don't align with compliance baselines, the whole setup can be flagged as non-compliant. Auditors don't care how happy your users are if the system lets privileged accounts authenticate without proper second factors. Take a healthcare organization I worked with. Their IT strategy was built around providing staff frictionless sign-on because doctors and nurses needed fast system access in critical situations. The choice seemed clear. single sign-on across M365 and hospital applications. The rollout looked perfect on paper and created smooth adoption across the workforce. But once the auditors examined the setup, they flagged the configuration for weak conditional access policies. Accounts could technically sign in from unmanaged devices without enforced restrictions. Even though the organization had deployed MFA, the conditions under which it applied weren't strict enough for BSI standards. From a usability perspective, the project succeeded. From a compliance perspective, it failed immediately. This is the tightrope many organizations struggle to walk. BSI requirements demand layered controls over identity. Clear role separations, least privilege principles, enforced MFA, and risk-based access rules aren't optional. They're the baseline. In regulated environments, it isn't acceptable to say, we configured MFA for most users and will expand later. The requirement is total coverage from the beginning. And yet, productivity teams often push back, arguing that constant prompts slow people down. That's where conflict begins, between regulatory necessity and the daily flow of work. Think of identity in Microsoft 365 like airport security. Every passenger wants to get through quickly and without hassle. But skipping scanners because the line is long isn't an option. The system has to check everyone, every time, in a way that maintains both safety and throughput. You can't optimize away the controls because they are the very mechanism that guarantees trust. Auditors take the same stance. You can assure them that adoption is great, that users love the experience, but if the gates aren't secured, none of the usage metrics matter. So how do you achieve secure identity without paralyzing user experience? It's not about choosing between usability and compliance, it's about layering the right tools. In most cases, that means hybrid identity setups connecting on-premises Active Directory with Azure AD, reinforced by conditional access policies designed according to risk. For standard users, you tighten access gradually with MFA and location-based rules. For privileged roles, you enforce stricter conditional policies, privileged identity management, and mandatory logging. This approach allows flexibility where risk is lower while keeping critical accounts under the highest scrutiny. What makes this effective is that it satisfies the letter of BSI requirements without creating an impossible workflow for staff. You can reduce the number of unnecessary prompts by using modern authentication methods like Windows Hello for Business, while still ensuring that every login event is verified based on context, device state, location, role, and risk signals. In other words, you shift from a blanket, all users everywhere must do the same thing model to a layered, risk-based model. This reduces friction while still letting auditors see complete coverage. The key takeaway here is that identity configuration is not just another technical box to check, it is the compliance foundation. If logins are insecure, no amount of data governance or policy documentation can save the environment. Everything relies on trusted identities as the gatekeepers to data, collaboration, and service operations. And because M365 is fundamentally identity-driven, missteps here cascade into every other compliance area. And just as critical as how users sign in is what happens after they get access. Identity keeps the gate secure, but once inside, the movement, classification, and handling of data create an entirely new set of compliance challenges, ones that organizations often struggle to recognize until auditors flag them. The silent trap, data governance and security baselines. If your data governance isn't airtight, you're already out of compliance. And the worst part is, you probably won't realize it until the first audit. Identity tends to get a lot of focus because it feels tangible. Logins, MFA, conditional access. Data governance, on the other hand, is quieter. It lives in the background, shaping how information is stored, labeled, retained, and logged. That silence is exactly what makes it dangerous. Everything looks fine until someone asks for a report on where regulated data moved in the last 3 months, and suddenly you realize your policies don't generate the evidence you need. KRITIS requirements demand more than generic security practices. They require precision. Every piece of sensitive data needs clear classification rules. You must define whether a document belongs in a sensitivity label, what retention period applies, and how access needs to be logged. It doesn't matter if you're a hospital dealing with patient records, an energy provider handling operational data, or a public administration managing citizen information. The mandate is the same: classify, retain, protect, and prove it. And it's the prove it part that usually causes the most trouble. Yes, Microsoft gives you tools. You get sensitivity labels, retention policies, information protection scans, and auditing capabilities through Purview. But here's the catch: the defaults don't align neatly with BSI standards. Out-of-the-box settings might cover a general compliance check. The moment auditors apply local regulatory requirements, gaps appear. They want logs that detail who accessed a classified document and when. They want specific evidence that a retention policy stopped someone from deleting regulated information. If your tenant only uses default audit streams, you won't have that level of reporting. I've seen a utility provider run headfirst into this trap. They rolled out retention policies, confident that everything critical was being archived correctly. On paper, it looked compliant. But when regulators came in, they asked for a trail showing every instance of sensitive data being moved or copied. The environment couldn't generate those logs. Policies were in place, but the necessary transparency wasn't. Auditors immediately flagged the gap, which put the organization into remediation mode just months after go live. That scenario isn't unique. It's typical of teams that lean on configuration alone without building an evidence model for audits. This is why the pain points almost always hide in log management and data residency mismatches. Audit trails might exist technically, but exporting them in a regulator-readable way isn't straightforward. Data residency is another weak spot. Microsoft might promise that content storage happens within set regions, but metadata logs or service interconnects don't always follow the same boundaries. An auditor digs into these details, and suddenly your assumption that everything is in the right geo falls apart under scrutiny. Another hidden trap many teams stumble into is documentation. BSI expects formal, structured documentation of how policies are designed, enforced, and validated. Guess what Microsoft doesn't generate for you? That documentation. Sure, you can pull reports from the admin portal, but they don't exist in the audit-ready format compliance officers required. This means you either prepare it manually or you get flagged later for incomplete proof. It's not just about having controls, it's about demonstrating that the controls are live, monitored, and aligned with the mandate. Security baselines add another layer of complexity. Make them too rigid, and workflows grind to a halt. Suddenly, users can't share documents even with internal departments because the policies are overzealous. People will find workarounds, emailing files unencrypted or using personal cloud storage, undermining compliance entirely. Make baselines too loose, and auditors will have no trouble finding the weak points. Striking the right balance between operational usability and regulatory proof is one of the hardest parts of implementation. The uncomfortable truth is that no matter how much you configure, standard Microsoft 365 won't close every gap. It's not a question of technical skill. It's a limitation of the platform. Microsoft provides an extensive toolbox, but some audit requirements, especially under BSI, sit outside its reporting or residency models. You can spend endless hours tuning settings, and you'll still fall short of coverage in at least some categories. That's why so many organizations get blindsided. They think they're safe because they followed the Microsoft documentation, only to learn that BSI's expectations exceed the platform's native capabilities. The missing piece comes from external compliance tooling. Third-party solutions fill the reporting gaps, extend auditing granularity, and generate regulator-friendly documentation. They turn raw logs into compliance evidence, bridge residency reporting, and create dashboards that map directly to standards. This isn't about buying shiny add-ons, it's about survival in a regulated environment. Microsoft lights the foundation, but those certified extensions provide the measurable proof auditors look for. Without them, you're left scrambling when an inspection arrives. So, if identity is the first visible hurdle, data governance is the silent trap waiting in the background. And the only way to avoid getting caught is by supplementing Microsoft's toolbox with systems that close the evidence gap. Which naturally raises the next question: what extra tools do you actually need beyond Microsoft's stack? Closing the gaps Microsoft won't tell you about. What if the one piece that makes you compliant is something Microsoft doesn't even sell? That realization often comes late in the game, usually during the first audit panic. Organizations assume that moving to an E5 license or enabling every native feature automatically covers compliance. But the hard truth is that even with the most expensive SKU, some of the gaps can't be closed unless you bring in additional tools. Microsoft provides a strong base, but regulators aren't grading you on Microsoft's certifications. They are grading you on whether your specific tenant is producing the right evidence in the right format at the right time. And that's where the cracks start to show. A common mistake I see is leaders treating compliance as a licensing problem. The thinking goes, if I buy the right edition of Microsoft 365, like E5 with advanced compliance or Defender features, I'm safe. But a license doesn't guarantee compliance. It only gives you potential functionality. The real work is in configuring it, aligning it with BSI requirements, and proving it works with documentation. And in some cases, even that isn't enough. There are areas where Microsoft doesn't provide the type of audit-ready records regulators demand, no matter how carefully you configure things. That's when organizations realize they need more than Microsoft alone. Take one project I supported for a federal agency that had migrated most of their collaboration workloads to the cloud. They used the full compliance tooling within Microsoft 365, set up retention and labeling, and logged activity with Purview. On paper, it looked complete. But as soon as their internal audit team asked for forensic-level logging of file movement in sensitive libraries, the cracks appeared. Microsoft's audit streams existed, but they weren't detailed enough, and exporting them aligned to BSI documentation standards wasn't possible. To satisfy auditors, the agency had to deploy a third-party logging solution that captured the missing detail. The same story repeated for data residency verification. Microsoft confirmed content was in region, but when the regulator pressed for proof down to metadata paths and service interconnections, native reporting couldn't provide it. Again, external tooling filled the gap. That's the uncomfortable reality. Some of the most critical compliance functions are exactly the ones Microsoft doesn't natively deliver in a format acceptable to regulators. Think log retention beyond default limits, forensic level drill down into user activity, and detailed regulator-friendly reporting templates. These aren't extras, they are requirements, and you don't discover you need them until someone officially asks you to show the evidence. By then, deploying them in a production tenant under audit pressure becomes painful. It's a bit like buying a car advertised as fully safe. It comes with airbags, it passes crash tests, it looks complete. But once you sit inside, you realize there's no seat belt. Microsoft's stack has the big structural protections, the airbags, if you will. But compliance under BSI often requires the seatbelts too, and those come as separate solutions. Without them, the auditors aren't impressed by the airbags. They point to the missing belt and flag the finding. The critical mistake is thinking of third-party tools as nice to have. In a regulated environment, they're survival essentials. And the categories repeat from project to project. First, extended log management and retention, because native logs expire or lack the depth needed. Second, forensic and investigation tools that can reconstruct actions in a way auditors trust. Third, reporting platforms designed to align directly with regulator templates, so the evidence you hand over looks structured instead of improvised. And depending on your sector, additional residency verification tools that track exactly where data and metadata flow can also become essential. Most organizations don't realize which tools they're missing until the first audit panic sets in. It usually starts with a simple request. Show us the logs for this event 3 months ago. When you realize those have already rolled off, you're already non-compliant. The panic spreads from there as teams scramble to retrofit non-native solutions into an environment that's already live. That scramble could have been avoided if the tools had been identified during the planning stage. So the compliance stack in a regulated Microsoft 365 environment isn't just the Microsoft core. It's a hybrid approach. You put Microsoft services at the center, Exchange, Teams, SharePoint, Azure AD. Then you layer on certified extensions for log retention, forensic proof, and audit-ready reporting. That combination provides both operational functionality for end users and the evidence regulators want to see. If either half is missing, the environment doesn't hold up under inspection. Now that you can see both the trap and the fix, the real question shifts. It's no longer about whether Microsoft alone is compliant, but how you turn M365 into a resilient tool by adding the right extensions at the right time. And that leads us directly into the bigger insight that reframes the entire compliance journey. M365 on its own won't guarantee compliance, but when you approach it with strategy, planning, and the right extensions, it stops being just a collaboration platform and becomes part of your organization's resilience. The practical next step is simple. Don't wait for your regulator to point out flaws. Audit your own identity setup, access policies, and governance processes now. Gaps are always cheaper to fix before they're written into an audit report. And remember, compliance isn't a one-time checkbox. It's an ongoing discipline that matures alongside your cloud environment, and it never truly stops evolving.